Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Roosevelt Institute's April Book Talk series. We love hosting these book talks because we really view them as an opportunity to build a community of practitioners, academics, and writers who are thinking broadly about the past and present of neoliberalism. To that end, we are so pleased to welcome all of you, along with two longtime members of the Roosevelt community, Natalie Foster and Roosevelt's chief economist, Joe Stiglitz, today. Natalie Foster is the author of the new book, The Guarantee, which we're talking about today. She is president and co-founder of the Economic Security Project, a network dedicated to advancing a guaranteed income in America and reining in the unprecedented concentration of corporate power. Natalie is also a senior fellow at the Future of Work Initiative, an initiative of the Aspen Institute Economic Opportunities Program. She has launched and run several successful progressive startups and has been awarded fellowships at the Institute for the Future, Rockwood Leadership Institute, and New America, California. She's a board member of the California Budget and Policy Center, Higher Ground Labs, Liberation and Generation, and Next River. And Joe Stiglitz is an American economist and a professor at Columbia University, and also the author of a brand new book, The Road to Freedom, Economics and the Good Society. He is also the co-chair of the high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress at the OECD, and the Roosevelt Institute's chief economist. A recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. He's also the former senior vice president and chief economist of the World Bank and a former member and chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Moderating the conversation today will be Felicia Wong, president and CEO of the Roosevelt Institute. Felicia was also the U.S. representative on the G7 Economic Resilience Panel in 2021 and served on the Biden-Harris Administration Transition Advisory Board, and currently serves as vice chair of the Treasury Advisory Committee on Racial Equity. Felicia, over to you.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. You didn't introduce yourself, but that was Suzanne Kahn, the amazing Suzanne Kahn, who runs the Roosevelt think tank. Thanks to everyone for joining us on this gorgeous day. I am so excited to be talking today with Joe and Natalie about their books. We were saying as we were prepping that they are birthday twins through their books now. And this is Natalie's first book, and this is Joe's, I don't know, somewhere in the teens, Joe. And it's so great to put these books in conversation with each other because they have so much in common, even though stylistically they obviously have differences. What I think is so fascinating is that both of these books start from the argument that the neoliberal system, which said it was all about freedom, really utterly failed to provide the kinds of freedoms that matter most to people, right? So Natalie, in The Guarantee, you talk to many people, too many activists and, thinkers and doers throughout our country about why freedom requires a guarantee. And Joe, your book starts with Milton Friedman and starts with the intellectual idea. What is freedom really? The conceptual idea, what is freedom really? And why is it that we need government to help craft and shape markets if we're going to get true freedom, that means that people will really feel and experience economic freedom, but also, political freedom, philosophical freedom. And what I find most inspiring after so many years of talking to you and others who are joining us in this book talk, we spent a lot of time talking about these issues, let's be honest. But many of them are more real today than we ever could have imagined, especially in the United States. And I hope increasingly throughout the globe. Joe, you'll probably talk about that. But I find it inspiring that so much of this is gone from the page and people's minds into reality. This is a moment like one we haven't seen in decades, and I think we shouldn't waste it. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Joe to make some opening comments about his book, then to Natalie to make some opening comments about her book. Oh, yes, I should give the titles of the books. Joe has written The Road to Freedom, and Natalie has written The Guarantee. So Joe's going to start with The Road to Freedom, then Natalie's going to talk about The Guarantee. I've got a few questions teed up, and then at about 45 minutes in, we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So please get ready. We'll have a conversation. But Joe, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity to present some of the ideas in my book. I begin with the idea that the word freedom has been co-opted by the right. And in fact, we need to begin by thinking about what freedom really means. And when we do that, I think we come to the conclusion that the agenda that the progressives have been pushing is the agenda that actually expands the freedom of the most individuals in the most meaningful way. And since this is the Roosevelt Institute, I should obviously pay homage to the fact that Roosevelt talked about the four freedoms, and he expanded the discussion then of what freedom meant, including freedom from fear, freedom from hunger. It was more than just political freedom. And one way of thinking about this, I'm looking at this very much through the lens of an economist, is that freedom means what you can do. It's your opportunity set, as we would put it formally. Somebody at the verge of starvation really doesn't have much freedom. He does what he has to do to survive. Another very related idea is that one person's freedom can impinge on that of another. And that's obviously very salient in our urbanized 21st century world. It was always true. The Ten Commandments was about how a civilized society has to interact. You take away the freedom of the thief when thou says, thou shalt not steal. But by taking away the freedom of the thief, you expand the freedom of society more generally. But that that idea it gets manifested in many, many ways in our society today. The freedom to carry a gun, an AK-47, has resulted in mass murders that has reduced others' freedom to live, which is a much more important freedom. So as Isaiah Berlin put it, freedom for the wolves has often meant death for the sheep. But I go beyond that to talk about how a little bit of coercion can actually be freeing. And the obvious example is stoplights. Stoplights say you can't go, you have to take turns going through an intersection. But in New York, we all know that in the absence of stoplights, we couldn't move at all. We'd have gridlock. So nobody would have the freedom to move. Stoplights actually enhance our ability to move. But that idea actually has more general applicability. If we think about where we are today after the pandemic, we wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for government investments in the mRNA platform that led to the vaccine, that it protected all of us. But if you're going to have public investments in infrastructure, and research and technology, education and health that are so important for our well-being, you have to finance them. And that requires taxation. And of course, the problem there is what economists call the free rider. You have to have a little bit of compulsion because otherwise you would have everybody free riding on the contributions of others. And so that brings me to, in a sense, the fundamental fallacy of the right. They looked at a very narrow conception of freedom And they didn't realize how we're all so interdependent. And they at least didn't give due recognition of the importance of this for a modern economy. And so that leads us to the question of what kinds of economic systems and political are most likely to lead to the most meaningful sense of freedom, freedom to do and freedom from harm. And here, I begin by a critique of neoliberalism. Neo just means new, liberalism is freeing. The idea was new because it was going beyond 19th century liberalism. It didn't really do that. But the freedom that it talked about was the freedom of the corporations to do what they would, freedom of rich individuals to be free of taxes, but that didn't lead to a well-functioning economy. It led to the financial sector exploiting the rest of us, and the greatest economic downturn that we've had in 75 years. It leads to the kind of monopolization that the Roosevelt Institute has put so much emphasis, and I put so much emphasis on, and the Biden administration has put so much emphasis on. So it led to the freedom of the exploiter, but took away the freedom of the exploited. And that leads then to the final question: what kind of a system would actually deliver on meaningful freedom? And that's the kind of progressive capitalism that I've been advocating. And that means we have to have regulations to protect us against bad behavior on the part of those who would exploit us, and the agglomeration of market power. We have to have public investments that are necessary, that provide greater freedom for all of our citizens. We need, in a sense, have to come together, and in doing that, we can, I think, expand the freedom of most of our citizens in the most meaningful way. So it's a call to recapture the language of freedom for the progressives, and realize that the kinds of economic reforms that we've been advocating, not small reforms, a lot of these are big reforms, are absolutely essential if we are going to create the kind of free society that we would like to have.
Thank you so much, Joe. I'm going to come back to this question of recapturing the language of freedom for progressives. But before we get there, I want to turn it over to Natalie to talk about her book, The Guarantee, and really, Natalie, about the adventures you had in meeting with and talking to and learning from so many wonderful people who feature in your book.
Yeah, well, thank you, Felicia. And one of those many, you both are those people that feature so prominently, whose work and scholarship my book is building on. So it is such an honor to be in conversation with you both. And Professor Stiglitz, your book is just beautiful. I was so lucky to get a copy and get to read it. And I just am so glad you wrote it. And it's very resonant with me. My friend and collaborator, Mia Birdsong, has embarked on a project to re-examine freedom as well, and its deeply interconnected roots, and challenge the toxic pull yourself up by your bootstraps myth that we just lionize in this country. And so I'm excited to get to be in conversation with the concept of a new freedom. And the pandemic reminded us just how interconnected we are. And the pandemic was also a moment where we would remake social policy in a way that I've not seen in my lifetime. And so what I'm talking about in The Guarantee is the guarantee of housing, of healthcare, of college, of good work, and so many more. And these ideas moved into the mainstream because of the hustle, the vision, and the hard work of advocates who'd been laying the groundwork for decades, right? To do what, and Milton Friedman would say, progress is made whether in a crisis, whether perceived or actual, and ideas that are laying around get picked up and moved forward. And that is what we saw during that period of time. We saw the floor of what I'm calling the guarantee economy be built. And unlike the scarcity obsessed thinking of the last 45 years, the guarantee economy guarantees economic rights, guarantees a floor regardless of race, zip code, or religion. And that allows people to truly live the lives of dignity, of freedom, and of presence that we deserve in this nation. And the government has a really important role in making that a reality. So let me give a few examples of what I'm talking about. In the pandemic, we would see on the healthcare front, right? We would see government mobilize and put free vaccines in people's arms. We would see Medicaid expand and catch overnight the millions of people who lost their jobs, their income, and their healthcare, catch them and result in the lowest numbers of uninsured rates in American history, right? That is a healthcare guarantee. On the housing front, we would see a historic eviction moratorium. We would support people to stay in their own homes by helping them pay their rent or mortgage. And we would do big man on the moon style actions like purchase hotels and move in the unhoused, giving people a key to a room of their own. That is housing guarantee. We would see progress on the college front, right? For years, we would tell student debtors, the government would say, you don't have to pay back your loans, really freeing people from that ball and chain that they feel monthly. And then we would outright abolish billions of dollars of student debt overnight, time after time after time, getting us closer to a college guarantee. And on the income front, right, we would see government expand the child tax credit and send nearly every parent in America a check to help pay for raising children and in the midst of the rising, cost of living. That is an income guarantee. So this is the floor of what I'm calling the guarantee economy. And these things aren't final by any stretch. Many of them have been rolled back. There are real questions about some of the ways they were executed and how they centered community or didn't. But the point here is that we did it, that government did this in the United States of America. And I believe that when we look back on this moment in 45 years from now, we will see this as the beginning of a new economic paradigm and a new way of organizing our economy. Or I should say that is a path that is available to us. There are other paths that are also possible that I really hope we choose, not to walk down. So I'll just end by saying, we are the richest nation on earth in the richest moment in history. And that is the reason that I think the guarantee economy is something available to us as we march into, this age of artificial intelligence and continued precarity and low wages.
Thanks, Natalie. I want to stay on the possibility, on the rich, what can we do from this both mindset and actual material fact of abundance, collective abundance, but we're going to come back to that. Joe, I want to start with a question for you. You said we need to recapture the language of freedom for progressives, that the right has really developed their own kind of monopoly on the language, the use of the word freedom. And you say quite persuasively in my mind that their view of freedom is just not right, not correct. So how do we do it? How do we recapture the language of freedom for progressives? And in your estimation, why has it been so hard? Why do we not want to use that language as part of the way we talk about our, you know, our agenda, our vision?
Yeah, first, let me just reiterate the fact that the extent to which the right has captured that at the most important caucus in the Republican Party in the House is referred to as the Freedom Caucus. And as it works to take away freedoms of so many Americans. I don't know why the progressives have not embraced the freedom language. And the reason I wrote the book was clearly to say the Freedom Caucus is not talking about the freedom of most Americans. It's freeing up the corporations. It's freeing up the exploiters. But it's not leading to the broader freedom of most of our citizens.
Right.
And that's why it seems to me that if we take a more systemic view and recognize our interdependence and recognize that what one person's freedom can lead to the what I call unfreedom of others, this is at the essence of what creating a good society is all about. And the subtitle of my book is "Now the Road to Freedom: Economics and the Good Society." And that's really part of the orientation. Progressives begin with what kind of society we want to create. And the economy isn't there. We aren't supposed to be serving the economy. The economy is supposed to be serving us. We ought to be clear what our objectives are. So we begin there, and then we say, how do we construct a society that actually serves humanity?
Right. I do think that one of the reasons that the right and the left have different views of freedoms and why the right might be willing to lean in and the left is more hesitant, or progressives are more hesitant, is that the conservative view of freedom is quite individual. It is quite, and it might extend to the nuclear family. It might extend to your spouse, your wife, your husband, your partner, and your children. But other than that, the freedoms are very, they don't have a vision that goes to a broader society. They don't have a vision that goes to the kind of interdependence that at least traditionally, they haven't. I've seen some moves on the right lately, but I do think it's like at core, there's a different vision of freedom, whereas the freedom that you're talking about, Joe, is in fact a freedom that we must conceptualize and act on in a collective, in a society. So that and I think the left has a hard time like recapturing that, but your encouragement that we should do that is very important.
Yes, can I say one more thing? Which
Yes,
actually, in the end, what I talk about is individual freedom. It's
right.
the freedom of each of the individuals, but we are embedded in a community, and it's that their fundamental flaw. So I'm not taking a broader perspective. I'm looking at it even within the narrow individualistic perspective of how we evaluate societies. But even within that narrow perspective, if we don't take into account how each of us affects others, we're really making a big mistake. And this, by the way, feeds in very much to Natalie's book, where she talks about the myth of how each of us can do this individualism kind of myth that has been so strong in America.
Yeah, well, that's a great pass. A Zoom pass over to Natalie. I'm going to come to you in just one second. I think Joe's totally right. And Joe, I would just say that maybe one way to think about your book is that you're pointing out that the conservative view of freedom has failed even by its own definition,
Exactly.
even by its own individual definition. And I think that's an important point. So, Natalie, Joe, threw the ball to you. you point out the myth of individualism, and then you have a rights framework and a guarantee framework, which is also about individuals, but it's also about what we owe to each other. So talk about the guarantee framework, because you use that to stitch together housing and childcare and food and all these issues that we might think of as separate. You stitch them together in a guarantee. So talk about the guarantee as an idea.
Yeah, I will. I have this memory of celebrated economist Derek Hamilton at the New School asking this really profound question: what is the purpose of the economy? And it struck me because I had been brought up to believe the economy was like the weather, right? The economy was something that happened to us, and that really just get a bigger umbrella. That's the job of the individual in such a society. And I have come to understand that no, it is not like the weather. It is like a house that we build every step of the way. And when we lay plans, we get what we plan to build, right? So when we've laid the plans of the last 45 years, right, I sum up the neoliberal era by really 3 tenets: total faith in the market, zero faith in government, and people left pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. And this gets to this sense of freedom that we're discussing here, or the unfreedom, as Professor Stiglitz so aptly frames. That last piece is not only incredibly, challenging to society, but it's challenging to the individual, because it is essentially gaslighting us. It says that if we don't make it in this rigged economy where the deck is stacked against us, where we are betting on the house literally every time we try and play, that if we don't make it, it's our fault. We've failed. We've not worked hard enough, or leaned in, or hustled, or made it work. And in fact, we know that the game, is rigged here. And so I just think a new definition that is of, interconnectedness, and the one that focuses on the system, just couldn't be more important. And so, Derek's question continued to echo in my mind. And I felt like, well, what is the point of the economy? And as we think about a post-neoliberal economy, what would be the point of that? And I think it would be, I would submit, it's human flourishing. And the way you get there is through a guarantee economy. So it's really building on his work that looked at the Economic Bill of Rights that we're referencing here, of course, at the Roosevelt Institute, and thinking about extending it in to this multiracial 21st century future, that we're living in. And the thing is, I've been heads down building the guaranteed income space with my colleagues at the Economic Security Project and so many other organizations. And when I put my head up a few years ago and saw how much progress we've made on moving this idea into the political mainstream, right? There are now mayors across the country piloting guaranteed income. The expanded child tax credit was a core part of the American Rescue Plan. Every parent received the checks. That was progress that I was seeing across a whole host of guarantees. On the housing guarantee front, right? With work of the Kansas City Tenants Union and Tara Raghavir moving into the mainstream. The work of the family care guarantee, really laid the groundwork by Ai-jen Poo, and would come into becoming, an understanding of care as infrastructure in America, that we were seeing this progress across so many guarantees. And that laddered up to a framework, an economy, that if we're all fighting in our own silos, it feels like, maybe we're making progress, but the problems are still so big. But in fact, the success has been impressive. And so I wanted to name it the guarantee economy to help us understand how much, these ideas have moved into the mainstream. And don't get me wrong, there's still so far to go, but I believe it's incumbent upon us to both celebrate the progress we've made while still holding how large the problems are, that we can do both of those things.
Great. Part of what we're talking about here is ideas, and I got to be honest, part of what we're talking about is packaging. And one of the things, helping people understand these ideas in ways that are meaningful, are catchy. And one of the things I loved, Natalie, when you talked to me about your book idea, maybe 6 months ago, you said Americans love guarantees, money back guarantees. It's very American to love a guarantee. Well, freedom's very American too. So we'll get back to that. But that's one of the reasons I think the guarantee, literally the title of the book, the conception of the book, I think guarantee, there's a reason so many people are buying your book, Natalie. I think that people like guarantees. But I have two more big topics, and then we're going to open. We got a lot of questions in the queue, but I have two more big topics. Those of you who are in the audience who have questions for Professor Stiglitz and for Natalie, get them ready, send them to the Q&A. But the first set of questions I have is about the role of government, because both of you have talked about that. Both of you, you've talked about Roosevelt, both the Economic Bill of Rights and the Four Freedoms speech, Franklin Roosevelt, who I'm duty bound to, represent and to champion. But the role of government is both very important in your conceptions of the good life and the good society, and maybe somewhat complicated. So Joe, I'd like you to say a little bit about what you think government can and should do, especially if we have another, X number of years where people are in government who want to use government for the good. And then Natalie, I'm going to have the exact same question for you.
Well, I've already hinted at two of the important roles. The regulations that prevent other people from doing harm, the investments that are needed that open up the freedom for so many individuals through infrastructure, education, health, basic research, technology. I want to also emphasize the importance of what Natalie has said of providing systems of social protection that are a kind of security that the markets don't really provide. Markets didn't provide unemployment insurance, Medicare, care for the aged. There's so many things the market doesn't do. We really need the government to do these critical things. But with one of the problems of our society today is the high level of inequality. And part of the reason for the high level of inequality is the growth of corporate market power.
Joe, can you talk about the growth in inequality, not just as a moral problem, but as an economic problem? Just make sure. Yeah, I know you usually, I want to make sure people understand that.
Yeah. So it's an economic problem. It's a distortion in the economy when firms are able to get that kind of market power. It raises prices. All the analytics, the theorems about the efficiency of the market assumes there's competition. That's not the American economy today. My research and the research of a host of other economists have highlighted that we're far from a competitive economy. Prices are much higher than the cost, can't be justified by ordinary return to capital, risk adjusted. It is the market concentration, market power. We see it in Google, Facebook, Meta. We see it even in dog food and drugstores. It's just pervasive. That market power allows them the power to raise prices. That leads to more profits. The share of profits, corporate profits, has been going up. That leads to more inequality. But I also want to emphasize that the rules of the game, which are set by government, also have a big impact on workers, because they make it more difficult for workers to get together. They make unionization more difficult.
Right.
And now there's a large body of research which is called monopsony power, the power of employers over their workers. And the result of that is they have the power to knock down wages. So not only do they push up prices, they knock down wages. And of course, that
I
creates.
will say that just yesterday we saw an outlawing of non-competes from the Biden administration, and non-competes are a form of market power over workers, right? You can't go elsewhere, take your labor elsewhere. And so
I
anyway,
was so pleased with that because that's one of the particular examples where I was calling for a long
Right.
time, government to take a positive action to stop this kind of imbalance of market power that was leading to greater inequality that has now been well
especially
documented.
for like the majority of workers, it makes no sense for somebody who, works at a deli to have a non-compete.
Yeah, there were fast food workers. It
Right,
was,
exactly.
these were not stealing intellectual property,
No,
which
no,
is
right.
what they were worried
The
about.
original right. The original non-compete is for, exactly, an inventor. You can't take your invention elsewhere, but that's not how they developed.
And they became a very important tool for reducing labor mobility and making it more difficult for individuals to move from one firm to another, and thereby giving employers more market power. It's just one of the many subtle ways in which market power of firms gets increased and inequality gets increased. So when we talk about the role of government, it has a vital role in providing an enabling environment for human flourishing, to use the words that Natalie used a little bit earlier. So these are all important roles that the government has to play. The market can't solve these problems. The market created the problems of inequality. It created the problems of childhood diabetes. It created the problem, exacerbated the problems of climate change. We can't ask them to solve the problems that they've created.
Right. So Natalie, I want to give you a chance to talk about the role of government. And we've spent the last, 40 minutes really celebrating the role that government can play in crafting better, more inclusive, more fair markets, more fair society. But there are some trade-offs eventually, right? So talk about the role of government and talk also about where, anything that you might want to say about guardrails on government too. I want to make sure to give you the chance to say both of those things.
Great. I'm just appreciating lifting up the concentrated markets as a really important part of government's role in, rebalancing and making competitive markets, because we're also living in an era of illusion, right? I walk down the cereal aisle at the supermarket. I have two picky eaters at home. I see, dozens and dozens of different cereal brands. I think this market is doing well. There's lots of competition for my cereal purchasing. Now, 39 of those brands are all owned by one company, creating the illusion of choice in the aisle with the concentration in the market, which allows for everything Professor Stiglitz just laid out, including raising prices and making things, so unaffordable here. So I just think that to me is such a good example of the role of government is to ensure competitive and fair markets. And I'll also say, going back to that concept of the guarantees, but the guarantee is foundational to capitalism.
Sure.
When I started looking around, I realized guarantees are everywhere for businesses, right? The guarantee of courts and of
the right to contract, right to contract,
the ability to, be a shareholder in a company, but not be held liable for any of its corporate behavior. So guarantees are everywhere. And I'm arguing we should extend them for the people who make up the economy, for the people who work in it and buy in it and produce in it, extend guarantees out to everyday Americans. And then the other question of government is the ultimate arbiter of scale. And so what I've been tracking is how many of these ideas have been growing and tested and tried in the laboratories of democracy. The guarantee of income the guarantee of good work, when I think of the sectoral bargaining work that's starting to take shape in California. And then ultimately it's government that will scale these ideas. And so there's no real way to do it without government. As to trade-offs, I think that's a really important question. And I think, Professor Stiglitz will have the most to say about the trade-offs on freedom. I think that is where people's minds, go quickly. Another trade-off in my mind is that in order to do this kind of work, we won't ultimately have the obscene amount of wealth that is concentrated into the hands of a few that we have right now. Oxfam has told us, and in fact, Felicia Wong had an excellent op-ed in the New York Times reminding us that this decade, we will see a trillionaire. And as she reminded us, $1 trillion is a million millions. It is 1,000 billions. It is like such a significantly large number that it's hard to even wrap our minds around. And that is, one person controlling more wealth than many countries across this globe. And so I think one of the trade-offs will be we can't see that obscene wealth if we're going to have an economy that supports human flourishing. And that's a trade-off that I'll take.
Right. I think oh, go ahead, Joe, and then I'm going to go to questions.
I just want to, there is always a concern about if you give government power that there will be abuse. And that's why we need checks and balances. But we need checks and balances more broadly within our society. And that's one of the things I talk about in my book, that if you have excessive economic inequality, that economic inequality is going to be translated into political inequality, especially in a polity like the United States where money talks. And so we have to have guardrails on the extent to which money can talk, and we have to have guardrails on the extent to which there can be agglomerations of wealth.
Right. Well, I think you already actually pre-answered one of the questions that was just sent to me, which is, doesn't part of this require tackling oligopoly in the form of tackling Citizens United and money in politics? So I think you've already answered that question. And I also think what you have both elevated here, which is this idea that we definitely need trade-offs. But what we need, trade-offs are real. We don't need trade-offs. Trade-offs are real. You can't avoid them. But what we're talking about here is a rebalancing of government power in a world where companies and corporations have had such market power in ways that ordinary citizens and ordinary workers have been left with very little power. And so part of what you're both saying is we need to rebalance.
Yeah, can I add one more thing?
Yeah.
It's not only, I like to think of it not just government versus private enterprise. There are many other forms of institutions. The Roosevelt Institute is a think tank.
We're tiny, Joe.
It's tiny, but we need a lot more
Okay, there you go.
NGOs. We need a lot more co-ops. We need to think a lot more about different institutional arrangements, collective action like unions, collective action like class action suits. So there are many other forms of collective behavior besides government. And I think we want to foster a broader ecology of institutional arrangements.
Well, that is great, because one of the questions that just came into me is from someone in our audience named Jennifer. And Jennifer asks, do you see a role for large institutional investors and asset owners like pension funds in creating a more inclusive economy? So this gets, Joe, I'd love you to answer. This gets to the question of like, what other kinds of institutions do we need to guarantee our freedoms? Institutional investors. Yeah.
One of the problems today is that institutional investors like pension funds have their hands tied. The whole framework of governance corporate governance, pension governance, so forth, was very much shaped by Milton Friedman in the view that everybody should be focusing on shareholder value maximization, and that would lead to the well-being of society. Even before that became popular, I had written with Sandy Grossman a paper showing that was not the case. But Milton Friedman published his stuff in the New York Times. I published it in the Quarterly Journal of Economics and the Journal of Finance, and he had more influence than I did. And we have a misshapen legal framework. It is.
So is there a new legal framework that you would argue for to
Yeah.
give asset owners more power?
Exactly.
Yeah,
So,
okay.
so it is ironic that pension funds, union pension funds, can't express their view that the companies that they invest in should not be engaged in anti-union behavior. We should recognize that investors should be able to express their concerns about climate change, about social responsibility, about governance, and we ought to encourage investors to do that.
Yes, great. I think that's really helpful. I think it's I'm thank you to Jennifer for, reminding us that there's a lot of money out there in the hands of a lot of people that could be used in this more positive, pro-productivity, rebalancing manner. So thank you for reminding us of that. And Joe, thank you for reminding us that to do that, we need better rules about how these funds can actually utilize the power that they have. Another question I have, I think that this would be great for either of you, but I'm going to ask Natalie to think about this first. It's from one of our participants named Raymond. How do we address the lack of social solidarity amongst working people in the United States? It seems to me that we are not succeeding in talking about social programs that benefit all, like Social Security and Medicare. And we're not talking about them in ways that help people understand where the money is actually coming from. Ray goes on to say, every person I speak to about these programs believe that they're simply receiving the money that they put in through taxes. They don't understand that there are subsidies. They don't understand that there is a kind of social insurance here, and that many Democrats encourage this belief. Is this a mistake?
Yeah, I think that is right on. I talk about Suzanne Mettler's work of the submerged state. That the idea, as you aptly say, Ray, and you, Felicia, that there's so much work government does in our lives, often in middle class and upper class lives, that is hidden from view, and it feels often like it's the private market, like the way loans are repackaged up that are backed by government, but have the front end being a bank, or that it's the form of like tax deductions, where it feels like it's just part of the way things are, but it's actually government supporting things like home ownership. So I think you're absolutely right. But to your first question, I actually think right now is a very exciting time. And I know as an organizer that when you see momentum, you run toward it. You fan the flame because you don't know when it comes. And I see a lot of momentum right now amongst the working class and with solidarity within existing trade unions and traditional unions, like the fact
Unions have never been more popular. 70,
pull after pull.
Yeah, 70-75% of Americans support greater unionization, more unionization, whether it's the UAW or Starbucks or Amazon unions. And so there's the momentum you're running toward, Natalie.
That's exactly right. And this week we saw the first auto worker union created in the South since the 40s.
Right.
So if we need signs of hope and optimism, that's where it is. And I also believe we are currently walking amongst labor leaders of the ilk, like John L. Lewis and other labor leaders that would really shape the New Deal era, and Walter Reuther, others that were so important. And I think that is what Christopher Smalls represents to the Amazon workers. That is what Sean Fain represents to United Auto Workers. They're captivating the attention, the scorn, the question, but the attention of the elites. And I think that that is really important while they're building their union. So I track a lot of this and look at coworker.org, one of the many tech-enabled tools to support worker organizing outside of traditional unions and follow its growth and laying the groundwork for what we would see today.
Thank you for reminding us about the heroes and heroines who are amongst us today. I think that is a very important thing to remember in an era where sometimes, like, even in good news, it seems like all the headlines are bad. So thank you for reminding us of heroism. It's very important. I have another question from one of our participants. This is for both of you. I'm going to start with Joe. Talk about the elimination of poverty. Natalie, I know you'll think about this too, because you've thought a lot about the ways in which the child tax credit, for a short period of time, but a real period of time, eliminated poverty for so many American families. But Joe, I'm gonna start with you. How does the elimination of poverty help the rich and the poor alike?
Well, this speaks to a broader issue of the difference between narrow self-interest and an enlightened or broader self-interest. That there is a sense in which too many people at the top think short-term, short-sighted. They think that if they are taxed more, they're losing their freedom to spend. But in fact, by paying taxes, they create investments that can lead to a better society. So exactly, let me pick up on the issue of childhood poverty, where the American Recovery Plan that was adopted at the beginning of the Biden administration reduced childhood poverty by 40 to 50% in 1 year. And
amazing. Like, people who studied the CTC, studied childhood poverty, they were hopeful, but I don't think they thought that the result was going to be that significant.
exactly. And it showed a very important point that I've emphasized again, which is inequality poverty is a choice. We could have eliminated it anytime we had wanted to, or at least reduced it by an order of magnitude. But we chose not to. It took a certain kind of leadership and admittedly a dramatic event to get us to do it.
And a movement of people who've been arguing that this is possible for a very long time. It takes all of that, right? Leadership, external circumstances, and movements.
Exactly. And after the Republicans tried to make sure that it didn't continue beyond that 1 year, we're still fighting the fight. And it's right before Congress still today. But this goes to the point of short-sightedness. Children who grow up in poverty don't have access to health care, to education that will lead them to be able to live up to their potential. And many of them, unfortunately, will become dependent in one way or another on the rest of society, because they aren't going to be as contributing members of our society as they would have been able to do if we had made those investments. So we have such a better society when everybody can live up to their potential. Right. Everybody can make their contribution. And that's, some of the very wealthy realize that, and they have been very supportive of these kinds of measures, but some of them have not.
Right. Right. Natalie, I want to go to you on this question of, you can talk about the child tax credit, and you can talk more broadly about how eliminating poverty helps everybody.
Roy Bahat, a venture capitalist, has a piece in Fortune today talking about trampoline capitalism and talking about this Raj Chetty's work of these lost Einsteins, people that have big ideas, who would be creating and building in this dynamic country, but instead are not. We're working hand to mouth, are working 3 jobs, are having to focus on the basics. So if the basics were met, it would unleash human flourishing in this age, and would be good for everyone, and frankly would be good for the ingenuity and small business creation in this country. You know, for decades we've seen small business creation decline decade after decade.
Not recently.
You know, when we saw a reversal is during the pandemic, when we were investing in families through the child tax credit, when we were investing through stimulus checks and rental assistance, we saw small business creation go up by 21% in 2020 and 21. That's reversing the trend of the entire, you know, of my entire lifetime. So we know that this is the direction to head. And to Professor Stiglitz's point, poverty is a policy choice. We got to see in real time what would happen when we make a different policy choice. And even just the expanded child tax credit, right? We would see half of children being pulled out of poverty overnight. You know, we would see a number of parents say that they would be starting a business if they were willing to, you know, if they had that sort of security coming in. So I think it's I think we know what to do. We know to raise wages. We know to pass policies like the expanded child tax credit, but we also know to look at wealth, because it's the wealth gap, and particularly the racial wealth gap in America, that is deeply immoral. And there's another of the guarantees that I'm really interested in, and Derek Hamilton and I have a piece out today in Time looking at the guarantee of inheritance, or a baby bond. And this is an idea that, you know, has grown. I think there's Roosevelt papers on this. It was in white papers through the 10s and 20s with Derek Hamilton and Sandy Darity, scoping out what it would look like. And then in 2020, you'd have people like Cory Booker running for president on this idea. And in 2021, we'd see the state of Connecticut pass baby bonds in America. Many states would follow suit, DC, California. And it's the kind of idea where, you know, a child born at birth receives a guaranteed inheritance or an endowment to have when they're starting off their life, to be able to buy a home, to start a business, to pursue a degree, take a risk in their life. That is the freedom and the agency that comes with economic security.
Yes, absolutely. Well, look, this has been an unbelievably inspiring talk. I'm getting notes from the audience saying it's how inspiring it is. And I just want to close with one remark that one of our, participants has sent in. This person said, I'm struck by the observation that the conversation continually returns inevitably to the lack not of great rival ideas, but of rival strategic communication strategies. We need to get the word out in big ways and in small ways. And I know that both of you, Joe and Natalie, are doing everything you can to get the word out that there are better ideas. I want to thank both of you. We are literally at time. There is so much more to talk about, but unfortunately, we don't have any more time for closing remarks from you. But Joe and Natalie, both, happy book birthdays to you both. Everyone go out and make sure that you get the guarantee, that you get the road to freedom, that you tell your friends and neighbors and families about it, and tell them that there is a better way. So thank you, Joe. Thank you, Natalie. And thanks to my colleagues at the Roosevelt Institute for making this conversation possible. Thank you
so much, Felicia.
Thank you so much.